6:11 a.m., a desperate voice called 911. A nurse claimed her husband had been shot in their quiet Texas home. She said she woke up to find blood everywhere and her back door wide open. But investigators didn't buy her story for long, because buried at the bottom of a small pond miles away was the one thing that would expose the truth about the so-called Texas beauty queen. This is the chilling case of Darlene Gentry, the nurse, the mother, the wife, and the woman who thought she could bury her secret underwater. Before we dive in, if you love true crime stories that expose the truth behind the headlines, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Do you think Darlene planned it, or did she get framed? Let's start from the beginning. It was still dark in Robinson, Texas, when the shrill sound of a phone broke the early morning quiet. The clock on the dispatcher's console read 6:11 a.m., November 9th, 2005, a date that would forever stain the peace of this small town just south of Waco. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice trembled. "My husband's been shot," she said. It was Darlene Gentry, a well-known local nurse and mother of 3. Her words were calm, but oddly measured, as if she was fighting to sound panic. She told the operator her husband, Keith Gentry, was in bed, bleeding, gurgling, pink foam coming from his mouth, signs of a catastrophic head wound. She said she'd woken moments earlier to find the back door wide open and some of Keith's guns missing. It sounded like a home invasion, the kind of nightmare that felt foreign to a town like Robinson. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. The quiet suburban street, usually lined with sleeping families and porch lights, was now flashing with red and blue. Inside, Keith lay sprawled on the bed, motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. Against all odds, he was still alive, barely. The bullet had entered near his temple. There was no struggle, no overturned furniture, no sign of forced entry. As medics rushed Keith to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center, officers began scanning the room. What they saw, or didn't see, didn't match Darlene's story. No broken locks, no muddy footprints, no chaos, just eerie calm, interrupted only by the faint sound of a baby crying down the hall. Within 7 minutes of stepping through the door, detectives knew something was wrong. The scene wasn't what it seemed, and the killer, they suspected, might already be standing among them. To anyone in Robinson, Texas, Keith and Darlene Gentry seemed like the perfect match, the kind of couple who made marriage look easy. Their story began years earlier at Texas State Technical College in Waco. He was studying drafting and welding. She was training to be a dental assistant. Keith was quiet, dependable, the kind of man who worked hard without needing attention. Darlene was his opposite, bright, social, the girl everyone noticed. Together, they balanced each other. Friends remembered how natural their connection was. 2 small-town kids chasing steady lives, grounded in family and faith. After college, they drifted apart for a while, only to reunite a year later. This time, there was no hesitation. Keith proposed, and in 1999, they married, settling into a modest home in Robinson, right next door to Keith's parents. Life unfolded picture perfect. Keith worked as an engineering assistant at the local electric utility, while Darlene pursued her dream of becoming a nurse. They were blessed with 3 sons, Chase, Cody, and Cade, all under the age of 5 by 2005. Their home became the heart of family gatherings, filled with laughter, toys, and the faint smell of Darlene's home cooking. But even in the happiest homes, cracks can form quietly. Beneath the surface, the Gentrys were struggling. Keith's long work hours and constant travel left Darlene feeling isolated. When he eventually took a lower-paying desk job to be home more, their finances tightened. Yet Darlene's spending didn't slow. She liked things orderly, beautiful, just like her public image. Behind closed doors, arguments flared, mostly about money, sometimes about loyalty. Still, Keith never stopped believing the marriage could be saved. He loved Darlene, and he loved his boys. He couldn't see that the perfect life he'd built was already beginning to crumble. The morning of November 9th, 2005, began like any other for the quiet Gentry household, or so it seemed. Darlene later told investigators she'd spent the night in a separate room with their youngest son, Cade, who had been restless and unable to sleep. In that same house, just a few doors away, Keith Gentry lay in bed, unaware that the next few hours would mark the end of his life. At 6:11 a.m., Darlene called 911. Her voice was steady but strangely detached, as she described finding her husband shot in the head. She said she'd woken up, found the back door wide open, and noticed several of Keith's guns missing from the cabinet. She told the operator she hadn't touched him. She was too afraid the intruder might still be in the house. When first responders arrived, they found Keith barely clinging to life. He'd been shot once, execution style, while he slept. The room was eerily undisturbed. No broken locks, no signs of struggle. His pillow was soaked in blood, but the rest of the room looked immaculate, almost staged. Darlene met paramedics at the door, wearing pajamas. Her 3 small children clustered behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't ask to ride with Keith to the hospital. Instead, she stood back, clutching her phone, answering questions with clinical precision. The kind of composure you'd expect from a nurse on duty, not a wife in shock. Keith was rushed to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center in Waco and placed on life support. 2 days later, surrounded by family who could barely comprehend the nightmare unfolding, Keith Gentry was pronounced dead. What began as a frantic 911 call was now a full-blown homicide. But investigators weren't convinced this was the work of a stranger. Within minutes of arriving at the Gentry home, investigators sensed something wasn't right. The story Darlene told, a break-in, a missing gun cabinet, a mysterious intruder, simply didn't fit what they were seeing. There were no footprints in the dew-covered grass outside, no signs of forced entry, and no trace of panic in the home itself. Everything was too neat, too deliberate. Detectives began to pick apart Darlene's version of events. She said she woke at 6 a.m. and found Keith bleeding, but blood patterns told a different story. The pooling suggested he'd been shot hours earlier, long before sunrise. If that was true, then Darlene had been sleeping in the same house as her dying husband for hours without hearing a sound. That, investigators thought, was almost impossible. Then came the issue of the guns. Darlene had claimed several were stolen, yet police found them stacked carefully just outside the back door, untouched, as if placed there to look stolen. No burglar does that, one detective later remarked. That was for show. Her demeanor raised even more red flag. Despite her medical training, Darlene made no attempt to perform CPR or even check for a pulse. On the 9/11 recording, her voice was calm, methodical, offering detailed explanations rather than raw panic. It sounded more like damage control than distress. That same morning, when questioned at the police station, Darlene repeated her story word for word, almost rehearsed. But when the questions got sharper, she stopped. She invoked her right to an attorney and ended the interview. Outside, the small town of Robinson buzzed with speculation. To neighbors, Darlene was the perfect wife and mother, but to detectives, she had just become the prime suspect in the murder of Keith Gentry. Before she became the center of a murder investigation, Darlene Gentry was the pride of Central Texas, the girl everyone believed would make something of herself. Born Darlene Dos Casale, she was radiant, disciplined, and known for her effortless charm. She wasn't an official pageant winner, but everyone called her the Texas Beauty Queen. With her bright smile and poised confidence, she seemed destined for success. She grew up surrounded by stability and small-town values, family dinners, Sunday church, and a tight-knit circle of friends who adored her. Teachers remembered her as ambitious and kind, the kind of student who led by example. After high school, she pursued dental studies, later turning to nursing, driven by compassion and practicality. Beneath the surface, though, there was a hunger, a quiet obsession with maintaining a certain image of perfection. When Darlene met Keith Gentry at Texas State Technical College, it was like two worlds colliding, her charisma and his quiet strength. Keith was the kind of man who didn't chase attention, but earned respect. Their romance blossomed quickly, the golden couple everyone rooted for. When they finally married in 1999, it was the small-town fairy tale coming true. But behind closed doors, that beauty queen charm became a mask she struggled to keep on. Money was tight, expectations were heavy, and life wasn't as picture-perfect as it looked on the outside. Darlene still threw neighborhood parties, kept the house spotless, and dressed her boys in matching outfits. But the cracks were starting to show. To the outside world, she was still the radiant nurse, the devoted wife, the hometown success story. But those who knew her best began to sense something deeper, an unsettling tension between who Darlene was and who she needed everyone to believe she was. After her arrest, Darlene Gentry was released on bond, thanks to Keith's grieving parents, who still refused to believe their daughter-in-law could be a killer. They clung to the image of the woman who'd once sat beside them at Sunday lunch, laughing and passing mashed potatoes, not someone capable of murder. But investigators weren't done. They still didn't have the murder weapon, and without it, the case was incomplete. Weeks later, a strange twist unfolded. Darlene reached out to a local landowner, Robert Pavavella, about buying a quiet piece of rural property near Axtell, Texas. The land was peaceful, and it had a pond. Darlene commented that it reminded her of Keith's dream of taking their boys fishing someday. At the time, it seemed like a sentimental gesture, a widow looking to start fresh. But then, just a few weeks later, Darlene called Pavavella again with an unusual request. She wanted him to fill in the pond completely. No explanation, just urgency. Pavavella's instincts told him something wasn't right. He alerted authorities, and soon, divers and investigators descended on the water. What they found at the bottom chilled everyone. A .22 caliber revolver, the same type used in Keith's murder. The same caliber as the shell casing found in the latex gloves buried in her kitchen trash. Ballistics would confirm it. This was the gun that killed Keith Gentry. Police decided to set a trap. With Pavavella's help, they told Darlene the pond would be drained before being filled. If she had something to hide, they believed she'd come back for it. The next day, cameras rolled as the Texas beauty queen returned, wearing waders and carrying a long rod, poking through the murky pond where the murder weapon had already been found. In February 2007, the small town of Waco buzzed with anticipation as the trial of Darlene Gentry began. The once beloved nurse and mother of 3 now stood accused of murdering her husband, the man she claimed to love more than anyone. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, neighbors, and even old classmates who couldn't reconcile the Texas beauty queen they knew with the cold-blooded killer prosecutors described. The state's case was built on one word: premeditation. They argued that Darlene shot Keith as he slept, a single bullet to the head, driven by financial desperation and the promise of nearly $750,000 in life insurance. The defense painted a different picture: a woman overwhelmed, trapped in a failing marriage, but not a murderer. But when the jury saw the pond footage, Darlene wading through the murky water, probing the exact spot where police had already retrieved the murder weapon, the mood in the room shifted. It was silent, except for the faint hum of the video monitor. Jurors leaned forward. Prosecutors didn't need to say much. The image spoke for itself. Investigators testified about the staged burglary, the missing guns neatly stacked outside, the shell casing found in Darlene's own trash, and the calm, almost clinical tone of her 911 call. Piece by piece, they built a story of deceit. Darlene's defense called no witnesses in the guilt phase. They didn't cross-examine heavily. Some said it was a tactical move. Others called it surrender. After 5 tense days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours. When they returned, their decision was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. The woman once adored for her beauty and grace was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Her life and Keith's both forever destroyed. For most people, the verdict felt like justice, but for a few, especially Keith's parents, the doubt never fully faded. They had posted Darlene's bond, opened their home to her, and even helped care for her children after Keith's death. They believed in her innocence right up until the pond footage surfaced, and even then, part of them wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. But outside that courtroom, whispers began to grow louder. Some claimed the investigation had moved too quickly, too neatly, that once police zeroed in on Darlene, they ignored every other possibility. There was no eyewitness, no conclusive fingerprint on the gun, and no sign of forced entry. Could someone else have been involved? Darlene herself refused to break. From prison interviews, she maintained the same calm, measured tone she'd used on the 911 call. "I didn't kill Keith," she said. "I loved him." I still do. Her defense team later argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that the gloves could have been contaminated, the video misinterpreted, the narrative shaped to fit a conclusion rather than the truth. Years later, legal experts and true crime enthusiasts would revisit the case, questioning whether the jury was swayed more by emotion than by proof. The sight of Darlene, the perfect wife, the gentle nurse, sneaking back to that pond was too powerful an image to ignore. Still, there were unanswered questions. No clear timeline, no eyewitness, and no confession. Even her harshest critics admitted the motive, money, felt cold and almost out of character. Was Darlene Gentry truly a calculating killer who shot her husband in his sleep? Or was she a woman trapped in the perfect storm of suspicion, timing, and small-town judgment? The shadow of doubt would never fully disappear. When the courtroom doors closed and Darlene Gentry was led away in handcuffs, the echoes of her downfall didn't fade. They fell hardest on the 3 small boys she left behind. Chase was only 5. Cody was 2. Baby Cade, just 18 months old when his father was murdered, would grow up never remembering the man who once held him in his arms. Keith's parents, Wemon and Glenda Gentry, became their guardians. The same couple who once defended Darlene now found themselves raising her children, the living reminders of both their son's life and his violent death. In 2010, a judge granted them permanent custody and issued a restraining order against Darlene, cutting off all contact. From that day forward, she would never see or speak to her sons again. The Gentry home became both sanctuary and shrine. Keith's photos hung on the walls, smiling, proud, forever frozen in the years before everything fell apart. The boys grew up hearing stories of their father's kindness, his patience, his steady devotion to family. But when it came to their mother, the silence was heavy. The questions they asked as they grew older had no simple answers. Behind prison walls, Darlene kept every scrap of news she could find. Old photos, birthday cards she was never allowed to send, copies of her legal filings. She spoke often about her boys, calling them her reason to keep fighting. But the truth was brutal. They were growing up without her. And without Keith. The tragedy of the Gentry family wasn't just a murder, it was the shattering of a lineage. 3 boys torn between love and loss, grandparents mourning a son while raising his children, and a mother serving decades behind bars, haunted by the sound of her own family disappearing forever. Nearly 2 decades after that cold November morning, the story of Keith and Darlene Gentry still echoes through central Texas, a haunting reminder of how fragile a seemingly perfect life can be. The quiet town of Robinson has long moved on, but for those who lived through it, the memory remains vivid. The flashing police lights, the headlines, and the shock of seeing a beloved nurse branded a killer. Keith Gentry is remembered as a man of quiet strength, a husband who sacrificed ambition for family, who traded travel for time at home. His legacy lives on in the 3 boys he left behind, now young men shaped by absence and resilience. Friends say they carry his calm demeanor, his sense of loyalty, and his unshakable moral compass, the same values that once defined their father. For Darlene, time stands still behind prison walls. She continues to insist she's innocent, filing appeal, hoping for a miracle that never seems to come. In 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her request for a new trial, reaffirming her 60-year sentence. Her earliest chance at parole won't come until 2037, when she'll be in her 60s. True crime enthusiasts still debate her guilt. Was Darlene a calculating murderer or a desperate woman wrongfully accused? The evidence is compelling, yet not unshakable. A blend of science, psychology, and perception that continues to fuel podcasts, documentaries, and late-night discussions. But beyond the debate, one truth remains undeniable. 3 children lost both parents in one night, one to a bullet, the other to a prison cell. The Gentry case isn't just a murder story. It's a study in love, deception, and the devastating cost of secrets. A small-town tragedy that still whispers through the heart of Texas, reminding us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like someone you thought you knew. If this story gripped you to the very end, hit subscribe for more chilling true crime that reveals the darkness behind ordinary lives. And if you think justice was truly served, share this video and let the world decide.